Back to your host, Jim Freed.
All right, we're back. We're here with my partner up in New York, Jim McCarthy. He's a capital markets expert, being up there for many, many years. Worked for some of the big life companies, some of the big banks. Got his MBA at Columbia, was a city planner, way smarter than me. Jim, welcome back to the show.
Hello.
Hey, so Jim's been working with me. We've been putting together some white papers. We talked a little bit about our white paper that we've done on tokenization. Jim, let's go to the next one. Let's talk about C-PACE financing and stretch mortgages. What do you got on that?
Okay. C-PACE financing is becoming more popular as states implement it. One of the issues in the past has been that each state has to pass a law allowing C-PACE to be implemented. And then each county, each municipality has to set up their regulations and procedures. So it's been a long, slow drag. For instance, New York State has a law. Some of the upstate counties have laws. New York City is lagging behind everybody else. We actually have no idea when New York City is going to implement C-PACE. The other side of it was that banks have concern. The way C-PACE works is you take components of the building, physical components, that match a list provided by the government that provide environmental benefits, primarily energy efficiency. If you have something that matches that, you can borrow at fairly low rates against that amount. And the rates are low because the payments are collected at the level of your property tax. So from the lender's point of view, they're basically at the same position as the municipality and the school board district. That makes the banks upset because they look at it and say, oh, gee, there's somebody ahead of me. I'm not really a first mortgage, I'm a second mortgage. Except that C-PACE can't foreclose. It comes in, it's usually 20 years, and they just collect. And if something goes wrong, they just get passed on to the next owner of the property. So the banks are not in a riskier position because they can still foreclose. They're still first mortgage. So the C-PACE can't squeeze them out, but they have a hard time understanding that. So there's a lot of resistance.
That's However, a really good explanation on that. I had never heard that one before. That's great stuff.
Well, what happens is we're working with a C-PACE lender who is itself institutional, which makes the banks more comfortable. And we've got over 200 banks who will do C-PACE loans with us across the country.
Now, Jim, recently, up until very recently, we've had debt funds that have gone to 90% of construction cost financing, 91%. They've been pulling back. Now they're only looking to do 60 or 65%, and we've identified a couple of sources that'll JV alone with them. Talk a little bit about stretch construction financing and why the change in the dynamic is important.
What's happening with that is the same as everything else. As interest rates are going up, cap rates move up or expected to move up. Plus, with the economy slowing down, they really can't increase the income from the properties. So the values of the properties go down. And the reverse leverage kicks in. If you had bought something at a 10 cap and it moved 1 point, so life happens. You buy something at a 3 cap and it moves 1 point, suddenly you're underwater on your debt, especially if you took a high leverage loan, because good borrowers could get 90% financing, sometimes even 95% financing. So there's no equity cushion if the cap rates move or interest rates go up. So now banks are coming back and saying, well, we don't want to lend that much. We don't want to take the exposure. Plus, smart developers and owners are starting to say, we want equity cushion. Why take the risk of a high loan that quickly default? Especially if you're doing construction and you have a floating rate loan and suddenly you're something over LIBOR and LIBOR, which doesn't exist anymore, but you're over SOFR or whatever the alternative you're using. Suddenly that's what's going up, and your project goes from being a marginally profitable project, as so many are today, to being a loser. So we're seeing more requests for pref equity, that equity cushion in case something happens. And sometimes it's because the borrower is smart, and sometimes it's because the bank is smart.
So let's say that we put together a capital stack and it included C-PACE and it was relatively high leverage. What would something like that look like?
What we could do is bring in C-PACE. Now, C-PACE can come up to 30% of the cost, except that you're probably not going to find enough things in your construction budget to justify it. So say C-PACE comes in for 10, 15% of the cost. You then bring in the bank for 50% today, so you got up to 65%. And it doesn't sound high, but it's fairly cheap money. It's like we were getting from construction loans in the past. Then you have the pref equity position. There's quite a bit of pref equity money running around. We do have one fund we're working with who does multifamily. They do low rise and medium rise, and they just got allocated $1 billion by their client to put out. So there's lots of money for the right type of property. We're working on a hotel, same thing. Family offices coming in. They have a lot of money they need to put out someplace. They don't want to be lenders because banks are lending 3.5%, 4.5%, 5%. They like being bridge lenders, but they all like to be bridge lenders. So instead of lending at 12% and 10% as they have in the past, bridge lenders are now 5%, 7%, which means we're starting to see the banks and the bridge lenders run into each other. So now the play is pref equity.
So then it's really up to the borrower to decide what type of risk profile they want to have, and then go from there. And what we've been seeing recently is this desire to have additional equity in the transaction. What other good structures are we seeing, Jim? We've talked about CPACE and senior lending. We've talked a little bit about the tokenization. Now, they come together in the third component that we're going to talk about on the show, and that's crowdfunding. And we're going to tease everybody on that because we're going to have the head of CrowdStreet on next week, Jan Kamish, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. But crowdfunding, let's give them a couple of extra minutes here in this segment, and then we'll go one more segment on this. Crowdfunding really has been around for a long time, got kind of a bad rap, call it right after the Jobs Act was passed, but that's changing now. Jim, what's evolving here?
What happened was crowdfunding started out as a couple small companies, almost experimental, and they had their own funding. So they would close small deals and then push the shares out to their investors. That limited the amount of business they could do because it was limited to how much money they have. I think the first crowdfunder was out of DC, and they had like $5 million to start with. So they've gradually built it up, but there were a lot of issues as to the legal structures being used, how to market it, how to clarify, your client relationships, and so on. And there was, these were people who actually lent the money, so they were limited to what they could do. The next wave were people just saying, "Hey, I have a website. Give me $100. I'll stick your documents up on the website, and you can sell shares in it, and hopefully you'll do the paperwork." You've seen the same thing in tokenization, where people are setting up websites and saying, "Hey, stick your documents up, and you can syndicate it and tokenize it and stuff." It's still the same thing. It's unregulated, not complying with all the legal requirements, and setting up for disasters.
So really, it seems like the real watchword here is to have discipline and to buyer beware, and to have a guide or a consultant or somebody to sort of help you pick through all of it, because it's going to be tough because there's so many different ways to approach it.
Yeah, you used to call a caveat emptor. In the crypto world, they call it DYOR, do your own research. So you have to be very careful. Now, there are some very good professional crowdfunding sites, a couple of whom still do we'll put up the money and then syndicate it, so you don't have the syndication risk. But they're
Jim,
limited.
why don't we take a break? We'll come back after the break. Then we can go through all the different types of syndicators that we know, types of crowdfunders that we know, what we've been hearing that they're looking for, and whether or not everybody can qualify for crowdfunding, or what the real MO is. We'll help you crack the code on crowdfunding, which the best-in-class developers are using today to raise their equity, both PREF and GP. We'll be back after this.